Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 11th in a series of programs I'm doing on morality and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. Today's program will focus on the question, what are examples of garden variety evil? Evil which even respectable and respected people do. But first, this question, how common is evil doing? I think Jesus stimulates our thinking. In a passage from the Bible, which I suspect almost everybody is familiar with, you will recall a woman caught in the act of adultery is brought to Jesus. The punishment at the time was stoning to death, and the crowd asked Jesus what should be done with this woman, knowing again what the law was. And you will recall Jesus' response. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And as you might also recall, none did cast the first stone. The Russian writer Tolstoy also provides some illumination here. Tolstoy said, "There is no person who is so good that he or she doesn't need forgiveness." And the psychiatrist Carl Jung said that most people imagine themselves to be more moral than they really are. Jung, as a psychiatrist, went on to talk about the shadow. The shadow, according to Jung, is that aspect of our psychological makeup that most of us probably don't want to confront. And what does the shadow consist of? Well, it consists of many negative qualities, but among them, our greed, our lust, our hatred. Mark Twain, the famous American writer, also provides some help in understanding what I'm talking about here. Twain said this, and I'm quoting him, "Everyone is a moon and has a dark side which he never shows to anyone." Writer Willie Morris talked about the gentlest of people and what they had done to become gentle people. He describes the gentlest of people in this way. It is he who has warred the most, battled the most against his own inner violence. I'm confident that Freud, Jesus, and Buddha would agree with that the gentlest person, generally speaking, is the person who has battled the most against his own or her own inner violence. What might be the most common sin in the world? Again, what might be the most common sin in the world? I suggest to you, and many writers have suggested this, it could be indifference, apathy, doing nothing. Yes, doing nothing can be a form of sinning. It's been said that basically there are two kinds of sins. Sins of omission, whereby we treat somebody unfairly, for example. Again, sins of commission, whereby we actively do something evil. But there are also sins of omission. I think the writer, politician Edmund Burke provides some illumination here in helping us to understand this idea of sins of omission. He said this, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." And what kind of indifference specifically might sins of omission involve? Well, indifference to other people being treated unjustly, indifference to poverty and other kinds of suffering which people experience and endure. Indifference to social, political, educational and religious institutions, which at best are ineffective and at worst corrupt. Hermann Hesse addressed himself to this idea of indifference to certain institutions in one's society that might not be working well. Hesse said, "We can kill people through our indifference." Allow me to quote him. Again, this is Hermann Hesse, Nobel Prize-winning writer. "We kill when, because it is easier, we countenance or even pretend to approve of atrophied social, political, educational, and religious institutions instead of resolutely combating them." Hesse claimed that when people go along with institutions in society that are not working well, instead of combating them, we can actually kill people's spirits. It is interesting that Hesse mentions educational institutions, because education is a major problem in the United States today. And I think it's fair to say that garden variety evil is often present in the field of education today. I'm talking specifically about respectable people, even respected people, who go along with failing educational systems. I'm talking about those teachers and administrators who have gone along with ineffective school systems over many years, never speaking out, never making constructive criticisms, never proposing constructive changes in the system. Again, I'm suggesting to you that educators all over America, perhaps all over the world, who go along with ineffective educational systems are sinning by omission. And then there are those educators who sin worse than what consists of sins of omission, but actually commit sins of commission. How so? How can an educator in education commit a sin of commission? Well, when teachers and principals and others involved in education try to bully or even silence those teachers who are trying to bring about constructive change, that's real evil doing. Again, to try to bully or silence people who are trying to make constructive changes in education. I myself have witnessed such bullying, such attempts at silencing people who want to change the system, but who are looked upon as people rocking the boat by those who are benefiting from ineffective, if not corrupt, educational systems. Ineffective school systems can kill the spirit of dedicated teachers and administrators, and of course, kill the spirit of kids and parents. Let me now address myself to historical examples of indifference to evil, where people in history have committed sins of omission. Americans living in the pre-Civil War era who believed that slavery was evil, but yet nevertheless went along with it. There were more than 4 million slaves in America prior to the Civil War. While almost all of those slaves lived in the South, the fact is most Southerners did not own slaves. Some Southerners owned a great many slaves. George Washington and his wife together owned about 200 slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned about 100 slaves. Well, the point I am trying to make is that many people who had no selfish interest in preserving slavery in the sense they had no slaves, nevertheless went along with this system. Arguably, the most famous slave in American history was Frederick Douglass. Perhaps some of you are familiar with him. Frederick Douglass was a slave who escaped from slavery, who learned how to read and write, and who educated himself very well, so well, in fact, that he started his own newspaper in Rochester, New York, called the North Star. It was primarily an abolitionist newspaper. In other words, the primary purpose of this newspaper was to promote the idea that we had to do away with slavery in America. Douglass knew that the shame of slavery was not just that of the South, but that the whole nation was complicit in allowing slavery to exist. He gave a very famous speech on the 4th of July in 1852, describing what a 4th of July celebration meant to a slave. Allow me to give you his own words. Again, the words of Frederick Douglass, whom I've already said, is arguably the most famous slave in American history. He said this, and I'm quoting him. "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham. Your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." Pretty powerful language. Douglass addressing himself to a Christian nation. When I say a Christian nation, I mean the United States consisted primarily of Christians, as it does today, and him talking about the hypocrisy of Christians owning slaves. Viewer, I ask you to imagine yourself as a slave woman on the 4th of July, while a band is passing by in front of her, playing very patriotic music, and flying the American flag very proudly. You have 2 slave children, one age 9, the other age 15. Their education is prohibited by law. I've mentioned in previous programs, virtually every southern state prohibited the teaching of reading and writing to any slave, including slave children. So again, you're living in a society that prohibits the education of your children. Also, you, this slave woman, cannot legally get married. Slave marriages had no legal recognition. Why were slaves not allowed to legally marry? Well, because it would make it more difficult to sell a husband to some other owner. In other words, to split up a family. So slaves could only engage in what would be called common law marriages. And let's assume, by the way, your common law husband has been sold to another owner. And also you worry about your very attractive 15-year-old girl perhaps being sexually assaulted by your very lecherous slave owner. And of course, perhaps the worst sin that you and your little girls are being exposed to is that you are being conditioned to feel inferior to other people. Imagine a society conditioning 9-year-olds and 15-year-olds to feel inferior. What would you think of your children's teachers if you found out that your children's teachers or guardians were deliberately making your children feel inferior to other people? Now I ask you, if you were this slave woman watching this band go by on the 4th of July, playing patriotic music and showing the flag in a very proud way, do you think you yourself could find it possible to wave the American flag? You, a slave woman, could find it possible to wave the American flag. Wendell Phillips was a very famous white abolitionist. In other words, a white person who was very involved in the movement to do away with slavery. He gave a very famous speech at Harvard University in 1881, a speech which was highly critical of the professors at Harvard as well as many other academics in America. Why so? Well, because Wendell Phillips accused the educated people in the United States, especially the professors, of being indifferent to many important moral issues which had confronted the United States in its recent history. Among them, slavery and women's rights. Again, he's giving this speech in 1881. Slavery had been abolished a little more than 20 years before, but in his speech, he pointed out it was no thanks to professors that slavery was abolished, that the professors in America, at least most of them, had not taken an active role in the abolitionist movement. And he also pointed out that in 1881, the year he was giving the speech, most professors were not playing an active role in the movement to get women the right to vote. As you probably know, it was not until 1920 that women got the right to vote in America. That's approximately 150 years after the Declaration of Independence was announced. Implicit in Wendell Phillips' speech at Harvard, which was entitled "The Scholar in a Republic," was this question: of what use is a professor in society if he or she does not advance the cause of justice? Again, of what use is a professor in society if he or she does not advance the cause of justice? Phillips accused the Harvard professors of a lack of social leadership and also moral cowardice. Moral cowardice. Of course, the Civil War ended 200 years of slavery, but the South did not take its defeat lying down. Again, the South did not take its defeat lying down. It now took its revenge on so-called free black people. In the post-Civil War years, Southern states passed laws attempting to keep blacks in their place. That was the expression that was used. And what did that mean, keeping blacks in their place? Well, it meant keeping black people in a position subservient to whites in society. And how was this done? Well, I think most of you are aware of the means the South used. It passed a series of segregation laws so that black people suffered from a cradle-to-the-grave system of segregation, being separated from whites in hospitals, in schools, in restaurants, in cemeteries, even in churches, in beaches, in parks. The idea was that blacks would be kept away from whites. They weren't good enough, so to speak, to hang out with whites. Also, Southern states conspired to prevent black people from voting. Shortly after the Civil War, our Constitution was amended to say that the government, no government, could anymore prevent somebody from voting because of their race. Well, Southern states conspired to successfully get around this amendment by making it almost impossible for black people to vote through laws which made it possible for states to charge people to vote, and also for instituting what were called grandfather clauses, whereby a black would arrive to vote and would be asked, did your grandfather vote? And the black would say, of course not, my grandfather was a slave. And the white registrar at the voting place would say, well, gee, unfortunately then, you're either going to have to pay to vote or you're going to have to take a test to vote, a test on the U.S. Constitution. Whereby if a white person had arrived, and again was asked the same question, did your grandfather vote? And he did, well then the white wouldn't have to pay to vote or take any kind of test to vote. So again, Southern states conspired in this despicable activity of going out of their way to prevent black people from voting. And of course we know that besides the segregation laws, and again the laws attempting to prevent black people from voting, more than 3,000 black people were lynched in America. No trial, no lawyer. Black people killed. And almost always, nobody arrested, nobody imprisoned, nobody paying any penalty. In fact, we have postcard pictures of the hangings. I've seen such postcards because sometimes people who attended these hangings would take photographs. And you'll see the black man or woman hanging from a tree. And you will also see parents with little children on their backs, over their shoulders, so to speak, and people smiling, some people even eating sandwiches. It was a celebratory experience for some whites to see a black person hanged. Again, all of this in America. And as I said, no trial, no lawyer, no punishment for the murderers. So that people could literally get away. At one time, people could literally get away with murdering a black person. Enter Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. In the late 1950s, again approximately 100 years after slavery had ended, this Protestant minister, King, criticized the so-called religious people in America who are going along with racial segregation and all these other discriminatory laws and the actual lynching of black people. And again, nobody being punished for it. King himself was arrested at various times for leading protest marches in the South. And he wrote a very famous letter from a jail cell, perhaps the most famous letter ever written by an American. It was entitled, or is entitled, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And what did the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. say in this letter? Well, in it, he raised this question: why were so few of the clergy in America marching with him in protest against these cruel policies inflicted against black people? He wanted to know why so many priests, ministers, and rabbis and imams were indifferent to the cruel treatment of some of some of God's children in America, black people specifically. Again, God's children, black people. King's letter succeeded in embarrassing so many of the clergy, because the letter was published in many newspapers in America. And once the letter was published, again, in many newspapers, many clergy were now embarrassed to the point of marching with Martin Luther King Jr., and those who didn't march with him at least gave their support to the movement wherever they did live, and began talking up the idea that we had to bring this disgraceful chapter of American history to an end, and had to bring this disgraceful movement in the South to take revenge on black people for their loss in the Civil War to an end. I have a question. I have a question to the viewers who are watching, specifically those viewers who believe in God and a heaven and a hell. Public opinion polls show that a very large number of Americans, many more Americans than Europeans, believe in God and heaven and hell. Well, here is my question, but first a fact. Jesus said his two chief commandments were, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Question, do you think the white people who over 300 years in what is now the United States, who didn't lift a finger to correct the injustices of slavery and later segregation and lynchings, who remained indifferent to injustice, do you think that these people, when they died, had a good shot at heaven? What do you think? Dante, very famous poet, perhaps the most famous poet who ever lived, in his very famous poem, The Divine Comedy, claimed, at least in his poem, that God reserved a special place in hell for people who were indifferent to injustice. More about this next week. But as is my custom, I want to close with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in his masterpiece, Walden, said that we are all artists. He penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.